But then at one point, the whale just approached me, and then it turned like this, so it could look me right in the eye. And it was just this feeling of peace and innocence, and it was a magical experience. The United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. So you can imagine what sort of environmental burden that was and what sort of a political legacy that leaves the United States. The environmental issues were really just taken over and swamped by the conflicts, Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan, and that's part of the lesson. If you work in diplomacy on security issues, you're working on environmental issues as well, because we don't have the space or the bandwidth to address environmental issues when the world's on fire in other ways.
How do environmental concerns stack up against other international priorities? Does Arctic's unique ecology influence global cooperation? Can indigenous knowledge inform global environmental strategies? We will answer all of these questions and learn many more captivating stories from the lens of a seasoned ambassador's experience. Join me in welcoming Ambassador Tom Armbruster, a distinguished career diplomat for whom environmental diplomacy has been a cornerstone throughout his various overseas postings. His diplomatic journey has taken him to countries including Finland, Cuba, Tajikistan, and beyond. Notable positions in his career include serving as Arctic Affairs officers, overseeing nuclear affairs at US Embassy in Moscow, and being US Ambassador to Marshall Islands, amongst other significant roles. Join us as we learn from Ambassador's wealth of experience, witnessing how environmental diplomacy unfolds in real-world context and how it can help in mitigating climate change. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much to you. Wonderful to see you.
Ambassador, now we all know that aspects of environmental diplomacy has been the cornerstone of your work. But can we begin and first understand that how did you develop interest in environmental issues?
Yeah, sure. I think now kids in school learn about environmental issues very early on, kindergarten, first grade, 5, 6 years old. When I was growing up, really my first exposure to an environmental class didn't come until 8th grade, so 14, 15 years old. And our teacher said, go out and talk to somebody in the field that relates to environmental issues. And so I went out on a boat on the Chesapeake Bay and spent a day with an oysterman. And he made his living by dredging up oysters from the bay and selling them. And I've learned more and more about the bay, and I sort of fell in love with it. At one point, there were enough oysters in the bay to filter the entire bay in just 3 days. I mean, there were just billions and billions of these oysters in the Chesapeake Bay. Of course, they've declined. Luckily, I also met a waterman. I was able to work on a fishing boat for a while, and he described seeing just acres and acres of fish feeding on the water. And I had this image of how productive the bay could be. And for years now, there's been an NGO, Save the Bay, trying to improve the quality. And it's uneven, it's hard, but they are making progress in certain areas, falling back in other areas. But I think that was my first exposure, just the environment around me, making contact with nature there, people who lived from the environment, and that was sort of my introduction.
Now, Ambassador, I understand that you also chose science, technology, health, environment as your career track with the State Department. Can you also tell us a little as to what inspired you to do that?
Yeah, the State Department experimented for a number of years with a separate career track. Traditionally, it's political, economic, public diplomacy, consular, but they had a window of time where you could be an environment, science, technology, and health officer. And I did chose that. I had been a journalist before, and I did some environmental stories in Hawaii, for example, pesticide that got into the milk supply, things like that. And it just interested me. It fascinated me. And I joined it. I was able to work on the Arctic Council, um, went to George Washington University for a science policy course for a year, and then sort of the big environmental issue that I was able to work on was nuclear issues in Moscow. But they've now folded that environment, science, technology, health field into the econ portfolio. And so now econ officers cover these things. But it's very robust in the State Department. There are regional hubs around the world for scientific issues. Kathmandu, for example, covers India and South Asia. But it's something the State Department is very interested in.
Now, Ambassador, you have had overseas posting across the world, including, as I recollect, Finland, Russia, Cuba, Tajikistan, amongst others. Could you highlight some of the environmental aspects there which intersected with your work?
Sure. I'll start with Finland. And I met a documentary filmmaker, John Webster, and his focus throughout his documentary film career has been environment. He did a fascinating film with his family where they swore off plastic and oil-based products for a year. And the title of the documentary is Recipe for Disaster. He might have been talking about his marriage, I don't know, but it was challenging, but it was also enlightening of just how ubiquitous, and we all know this, plastic and oil-based products are. But they did a very good job. And then his kids kind of called him out and said, "Well, Daddy, what's the camera made of that you're making this movie on? Plastic. And what's it going to be on? A plastic film reel." So, you know, he was busted. But so Finland, actually, I worked in a warehouse at that time. My first posting, we were supplying the embassy in Moscow, and at that point, consulate in Leningrad. So I did very little environmental work except to work on a story on how the radioactivity from Chernobyl was affecting the reindeer. And the State Department was interested in that, and I was able to do a report on it and kind of show I was engaged in environment issues in hoping to get into that career track I mentioned. Cuba, I think it was just enlightening to see how an unspoiled environment can be. Of course, the Cubans bulldoze lots of land and timber for sugarcane, but still, you can go to the beaches and places that are completely unspoiled, and there are times when, for example, crabs migrate across the roads. And thank goodness when we were there in the early 90s, there just weren't many cars, because one car would destroy thousands and thousands of these migrating red crabs. But you know, we have something to learn, I think, from everybody in the environmental field, and that's why it's so important that international cooperation takes off.
Would you also want to talk about your experience as a nuclear affairs officer in Russia, wherein maybe you could broadly include it as the aspect of cooperation between two nations, so that maybe we can better understand how we can, in today's atmosphere as well, when we see that there are different geopolitical interests, can there be synergies for environmental protection?
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue, and I think it shows that there's a nexus between security and environment. If you don't have a good security relationship, it's very hard to make progress on environmental issues. Typically, scientific issues, environment issues, are the first ones to come back when a relationship is improving, and sort of the last ones to leave when it's deteriorating. With Russia, as I said, I worked on the Arctic Council, and one of the exercises we did was something called RADEX 94, where we simulated a nuclear accident in the Arctic. And then all the 8 Arctic countries told each other how they would respond. This was a conference in Anchorage. So, you know, tons and tons of people, and learning from each other. When do you distribute iodine? When do you evacuate people? That kind of thing. And Russia played in that scenario, and they were an active partner in the Arctic Council. They've become more problematic as a partner, and while the Arctic Council is still very robust, has lots of working committees, 30-some observers, Russia is not a full player, unfortunately. On the nuclear front, it's similar, where Russia in the early 90s was looking to engage and cooperate with the United States on nuclear issues. We're both, for better or worse, experts in not only nuclear energy but nuclear weapons. And so the Department of Energy and the military had separate programs under Congressman called Nunn-Lugar. There was something called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, and lots of money was being spent to train scientists to move from nuclear weapons research and work to civilian spheres. It was all very promising. A lot of money was spent. I made one, I don't know if you want to call it a complaint, but I sort of raised my hand and said, we're doing a lot of things with Russia that the government appreciates, and they're getting money from it. In fact, they're selling us highly enriched uranium that is blended down to low enriched uranium to burn in our nuclear plants. It was good for everybody. I mean, it's good for them economically, good for us in terms of security. But the average Russian didn't see that return. And when I raised my hand, I said, we should have some environmental programs that they can see on the ground. Clean up a river, do some programs in schools, things that the average Russian will appreciate. And really, we didn't have a Marshall Plan for Russia. And that environmental cooperation, the nuclear cooperation, it's not gone to zero, thank goodness. There's still emergency response and the hotline and things like that. But I think the potential was much greater, and we missed an opportunity with Russia, I think, before Russia decided to take this very hard turn back towards Soviet thinking, really. And of course, with the conflict going on in Ukraine, it's very hard to talk about any kind of environmental cooperation.
Now, Ambassador, you talked about your experience while the Arctic Council was being formed. Now, we all know that Arctic happens to be a regulator of the environment and weather patterns all across the world. And it also brings with itself unique ecology. So, can you explain a little bit as to how the ecology of Arctic was an important standpoint from the multilateral cooperation point of view when the Arctic Council was being made? What I'm trying to understand is, as you pointed out, the difference between politics and environmental issues. I'm trying to more articulate what was your experience with respect to the particular ecology of Arctic and how did people respond to it?
One of the most important decisions the Arctic Council made early on was to bring in the indigenous leaders and indigenous groups that were there. I think there are 6 permanent members from the indigenous communities, because they have a deep knowledge of the environment. As you mentioned, the Arctic not only affects the weather patterns, but climate change is impacting the Arctic at a faster rate than other places, losing sea ice and that kind of thing. But the indigenous knowledge is just fascinating. I mean, there's stories of a tribal elder who was in the hospital in Anchorage, and he had a dream, and in the dream, he talked to the whales, and he then described the dream to his sons when he got back home. He said, well, I know you went whaling, I know who threw the harpoon, I know where the whale meat was kept, and the whale had actually told him that they need to move the whaling season further into the season so that the young calves have more time with their mothers. And they did make that change. So there's a knowledge that indigenous people have that we that we really can't touch, given our lack of contact with nature. So that was very important. But it's a very pragmatic group, the Arctic Council. There are lots of working committees. There's some that look at just the level of contaminants in the Arctic. It's apolitical for the most part, which is why it's such a shame that we don't have Russian scientists as fully engaged as we could. But it's a successful body. I think it's been replicated now with, for example, the small island developing states working on climate change. There's now also a landlocked developing states group. This sort of regional sharing of knowledge and information is very important. It's a bit like COP, 27 or 28 or whatever it is, the COP meetings, but it's more regionalized, and I think It's quite a success, actually.
Ambassador, if I am allowed now to move to another experience of yours, which is in Marshall Islands. And I think that experience brought you face to face with the reality of climate change with respect to increasing sea levels, but also with the lingering nuclear legacy which we all know about. Could you share your experiences there, the initiatives that you undertook there, and some of the more thoughts that what more can be done because it's absolutely one of the most vulnerable nations to climate change.
Absolutely. Probably one of the three or four most vulnerable. And that's because it is an atoll nation. It was created when volcanoes wore away, the ocean wore away the volcanoes until you just have this ring of land at the very top. So maybe 3 meters above sea level, you land in Majuro and you can see the lagoon on one side and the ocean on the other side. And you realize very quickly how vulnerable people are. And it's not just that sea level rise could cover the islands, but every time it floods, that seawater gets into the freshwater supply and ruins the agriculture and things like that. So they're vulnerable in many different ways. The United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. So you can imagine what sort of environmental burden that was and what sort of political legacy that leaves the United States. We have obligations through what they call the Compact of Free Association with the Marshall Islands, where we continue to provide money for health, education, and infrastructure. And part of it, I think, is actually a moral debt. We owe the Marshall Islands for responding to what we felt was a national security emergency to test these nuclear weapons. We could debate that. Personally, I don't think we should ever test another nuclear device anywhere in the world, especially having seen the effects in the Marshall Islands. But the Marshall Islands has some of the most eloquent spokespeople on environment, on climate, and nuclear weapons. One was Tony DeBroom, who was a statesman in the Marshall Islands. He not only created the world's largest shark sanctuary, he also advocated and was a big champion for nuclear disarmament. And then for climate, he was the leader of what they called the High Ambition Coalition in Paris that was fighting to keep the goal at 1.5 degrees centigrade. So Tony was quite outspoken, masterful negotiator and diplomat and storyteller. He told a story in the UN once where it's a Marshallese folk story, but he said there was a whale, and the whale was bothering the birds, making all kinds of noises like wata wata roo, and the birds were saying, "Whale, please, you're driving us crazy." And the whale said, "Look, I'm the biggest creature in the ocean. I can do what I want." And the birds said, "Okay," and they all took one sip of water from the ocean, and the ocean dried up. And the whale said, "Oh, please, please, put it back in the ocean." And they spit the water out, and it filled up. And of course, Tony's lesson was that, if I do my little part, you do your little part, everybody does their little part, we can change the world. And it was things like that that would, that he could move an audience very well. And I sent you the poem by Kathy Jetnell Kitchener, another just brilliant Marshallese spokesperson on climate. She was the civil society speaker for the Climate Summit in 2012. She gave a poem at the UN General Assembly. She had the first standing ovation since Nelson Mandela and just knocked it out of the park, really. But I think, if we were to lose the Marshall Islands or any island, you lose not only that little bit of real estate, but you also lose this cultural understanding. Tony talked about how they understood dolphins and even had they knew the hierarchy of dolphin pods and things like that. There was a queen in a dolphin pod, but we would lose quite a lot. They were master navigators and sailors, and they still are. And I think we need to protect these vulnerable islands for many reasons, but one of the most important, I think, is cultural. On the nuclear issue a little bit more, we continued to provide through the Department of Energy. The United States provides scholarships for young Marshallese to learn about nuclear issues so that they can make good decisions about, for example, going back to Bikini, which is still not inhabited by people. The residents of Bikini were moved, never got to go back home except for one brief period, and their living standard was never the same because Bikini was a very rich island. The good news is that the program Shark Week, which is a popular TV show here, went to Bikini and found that there are still many, many sharks, or actually, I guess they've come back. But the environment can heal, especially if we help remediate some of the effects. And I think that's what's important, that we get scientists back there to keep working to see what can be done so that people can resettle in places like Bikini. And the conversation or the legacy will continue, I think, forever because it had such an impact on the country.
Would you also want to share your experience with the shipwreck and oil spill? Because I think that's a very interesting one, and maybe audience would find it fascinating that sometimes the things that are hidden which can have profound impact on the environment, and why these steps are so important for us to take.
I was at a meeting of ambassadors in the Pentagon, and the State Department is broken up into bureaus. So the Marshall Islands is in the East Asian Pacific Bureau with really big countries like China, Japan, Korea, big issues. And I always felt like the Marshall Islands was this little canoe, and these other countries, were like battleships, the embassies. We were at the Pentagon meeting with the Secretary of Defense, and somehow I found myself raising my hand again and saying, Mr. Secretary, there's a ship offshore in the Marshall Islands that was used in the nuclear tests to see if it would survive. Somehow it was towed back to Kwajalein, one of the Marshallese Islands, and it's sitting there, but it's also full of fuel. And it's been there for years and years, and it's rusting, and eventually that fuel is going to leak out and destroy the beaches. It's not going to be good for the military base there, and it's certainly not good for our relations with the Marshallese. And the secretary made a couple notes, kind of nodded, and I thought, okay, I did my part. And then I left the Marshall Islands, and about a year later, I got a message from my successor, and she said, oh, I know you worked on this, Tom, but I thought you might like to know that the Navy's sending divers and a team out, next week to take all the oil off the Prince Eugen ship, thanks to that encounter with the Secretary of Defense. So I think you can have an impact. That's sort of the message, that sometimes we think we don't have much of an impact, but really we can. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Thank you for sharing that. So, Ambassador, if I'm now allowed to move to your post-retirement experience, I was very fascinated by your article that you wrote about your experience of encountering a whale in Tonga. And I thought that to be very, very interesting. Why? Also because you came so up close with nature in such a way. Maybe I'll attach the photo here as well and link for the audience to read the article too. But if you could talk about your experience in Tonga, and also if you can tell us about your experience as a senior advisor to the UN, because that role particularly encapsulates not only the functioning of your previous experience in the government, but now in the multilateral cooperation affairs as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, I went to Nuku'alofa to help open the U.S. Embassy there. We'd had a Peace Corps presence for many years. They did a great job, but our relations were getting more complex, and Washington felt like we needed a full-fledged embassy. So I was able to see the flag go up, and hopefully it'll stay there for generations. But with respect to the whales, Tonga is one of the few countries where you can swim with whales. You go out on a dive boat, jump in the water when the guide tells you, and swim out and watch them. And I was a little conflicted because my usual default approach is to leave nature alone, just let them do their thing. But this was such a unique opportunity, I wanted to try it. And so I went out the first time and jumped in the water, and the whale seemed to be frolicking. I mean, it seemed to be in a good mood, and it was swimming around, and I stayed a little bit close to the ladder that first time, but then at one point, the whale just approached me, and then it turned like this, so it could look me right in the eye. And it was just this feeling of peace and innocence, and it was a magical experience. And so I ended up going 4 or 5 times altogether. And I went once with a man named Willie Lousy, who's a Tongan climate advocate. And we swam out, I swam out to the whale with my son Brian. And Willie said, you know, I'm not going to swim all the way to the whale. I'm going to go about halfway, and then the whale's going to come to me. And so Brian and I swam out to the whale. We watched it, filmed it a little bit, and sure enough, after a minute or two, the whale went over to Willie, had a look at him, and then left. And I've stayed in touch with Willie, and he is a great climate advocate. And what he's championing now is a corridor for whales. The whales that come to Tonga come from Antarctica. And what he would like to see is a protected corridor where they won't be harassed, and where ships are made aware of that this is a migration route. I'll link this now to the UN. I was at the UN at an oceans conference, and Sylvia Earle, who is a very well-known marine biologist in the United States, in fact, she's referred to as her deepness because she's so well regarded. I told her about Willie and the whale and showed her the picture, and she said, well, why a corridor? Why not the whole Southern Ocean? You know, so I think the real environmental champions are thinking big these days. You know, how do we connect these wild areas, and this whole rewilding philosophy I think is fantastic to try to bring things back to how they were. The real work of the UN when I was there in the beginning was the Sustainable Development Goals, which you're familiar with, and has a marine component, of course, a climate component. And there was a real feeling that the world was not living up to the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we've achieved maybe 17% of them. But what happened throughout the course of last year's General Assembly, and I'm sure this year, is that the environmental issues were really just taken over and swamped by the conflicts. You know, Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan, and that's part of the lesson. You know, if you work in diplomacy on security issues, you're working on environmental issues as well, because we don't have the space or the bandwidth to address environmental issues when the world's on fire in other ways. So, you know, folks who think, oh, I wish I could work on polar bears and, you know, and all the important environmental issues, but here I am stuck trying to work on this conflict wherever it is. Well, getting these conflicts resolved, I think, is a first step, because it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, you have to address basic security first, and poverty and things like that. And to a certain extent, I hate to say it, but environment is a bit of a luxury but we all, as going back to Tony's point, we all have to do our part, you know, our little part to try to make progress. And I think we can, and I think we are.
I'll skip my last question. My last question was based on the fact that because you've seen both sides, I was more curious to learn, you know, about the importance that environmental issues and climate change concerns receive with respect to other political concerns. But I think, as you've eloquently put it, the basic security concerns still happen to be the first and the foremost issues that are addressed. And as unfortunate as it might be, that's how things are in the international affairs realm.
Yeah, I think that that's true, but certainly hats off to the people that are dedicated to the environmental issues, and we all have our part to play, I think, is the main thing. But the more responsible countries are, and the more they address environmental issues, the better off we're all going to be.
So, Ambassador, that was my last question. Now, if I'm allowed to take a LinkedIn question to which I've seen that you have already given a brief answer to, but if I may read the question from Tanmay, which is about in a world progressing towards multipolarity, how likely are the competing interests of powerhouses to challenge positive developments in global climate change actions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we have to keep the superpowers accountable. There's some good things that we're seeing. For example, China is moving away now from the coal plants and going towards greener, cleaner energy. Um, the United States is still in the climate agreement. We didn't uh, pull out as happened under the Trump administration. We're full-fledged members of that. But we have to keep the big powers accountable. They do have to lead the way. But as I mentioned in responding on LinkedIn, there are these other bodies, the Small Island Developing States, Arctic Council, landlocked developing states. You know, regional bodies are getting together and doing things so that smaller countries do have a voice. And certainly the Pacific countries need to have a voice because they have these unique challenges. And so they have to be heard. And even last year, with all the conflicts going on, I would visit with the embassies of the Pacific states, and they said climate is still our number one issue. You know, even though, yes, they understood these other conflicts are important, but for them, this is existential. And so we need to listen to them and give them the platform to make their case and for us to understand it and help. Because I think if these low-lying countries go under, we don't lose just that land. We lose a lot. We lose a lot culturally. And I think it's also an indication that we're quite in bad shape, that the planet itself is in trouble. We always talk about
Thank
the
you so
canary in the
much.
coal. Yeah, we talk about the canary in the coal mine, but I think a lot of people feel like, well, it's not my canary and it's not my coal mine, but that's not
Yeah.
true. It is.
Yeah. I mean, that global commons problem happens to come every time, and how to shift the narrative from there happens to become a challenge with every policy decision, any which way. But I think the problem is not distant. We are facing it every day, and I hope it receives adequate attention. So,
Yeah.
Ambassador, these were all the questions from my end. Before we conclude the call, do you have any last thoughts that you might want to share? Any call to action or anything from your deep insights that you might want to share?
I would just like to say that part of my inspiration is people like you doing what you're doing with the podcast, the engagement you've got with your audience. You know, you can see you're searching for vectors and ways into this conversation between policymakers, scientists, students. I think it's vitally important, and I really applaud your work and wish you all the best in it. It's quite inspiring.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And it's equally reassuring that professionals like you take the time to share these deep insights. I would have never in the entire world have heard that story that you just narrated about a whale coming in the dream of an indigenous person. I think we all talk about indigenous solutions, but I think these practical examples bring the story home, and I think that's very inspiring to know. So, thank you so much for your time. I'm highly grateful for your support, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Anirudh. Well, let's stay in touch.
Yeah.
Bye bye.